My wife expected half of my expansion profits after filing for divorce. I showed the court the post-separation investment timeline and protected equity structure. The ruling was clear. She reached out when her assumptions met legal reality. You're going to lose half of everything you built, and there's nothing you can do about it. She said it so calmly, like it was already done, like she was reading a weather forecast instead of describing the destruction of the last 6 years of my life. I remember standing in the kitchen, coffee in hand, and just staring at her. Nicole had this look on her face, not angry, not sad, not even satisfied, just decided, like she had already run the numbers in her head and concluded that she'd won before the game even started. I filed this morning, she said, setting a folder on the counter between us. I didn't touch it. She slid it closer. I still didn't touch it. She exhaled, picked up her bag, and walked toward the door like we were wrapping up a business meeting. My attorney will reach out to yours by end of week. The door closed, and I stood there in a kitchen that smelled like her perfume and burnt toast, holding a coffee mug with a crack in the handle that I'd been meaning to replace for 2 years. I never threw it away. I don't know why I'm telling you that. Maybe because some things just quietly break and you don't notice until suddenly you're staring right at them. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. I was 34 at the time. We'd been married 6 years, together for 8. I ran a mid-sized commercial contracting company that I'd built from scratch, started with 3 employees, a second-hand truck, and a $40,000 loan from my uncle that I paid back in 14 months. By the time Nicole filed, we had 22 full-time employees, regional contracts across 4 states, and I had just begun the earliest planning stages of what would eventually become a major facility expansion and service division restructure. Key phrase, just begun. I'll come back to that. We didn't have a dramatic marriage. That's the part that confused people when we told them. There was no affair. No screaming matches that rattled the windows. No single catastrophic night where everything fell apart. It was quieter than that. Nicole was an operations manager at a logistics firm. Smart, organized, high-achieving. We'd met at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, bonded over a shared disdain for small talk and overpriced wine, and built something that felt solid for the first 4 years. But somewhere in year 5, the distance started. Small things, at first. She'd cancel dinners last minute and not mention it until I asked. Conversations that used to stretch late into the night started wrapping up in 10 minutes. She started sleeping with her phone face down. I'm not saying that last part as an accusation. I'm saying it because I noticed it, and I didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything, and we both just kept not saying anything until apparently she walked into an attorney's office one morning and said everything there. When I finally opened that folder, I found a divorce petition, a list of marital assets, and a preliminary claim that included, and I want you to understand how carefully I'm choosing my next words, a demand for equitable distribution of projected business profits. Not current profits, not documented profits. Projected. Future. From a business expansion she claimed was a marital asset because I had, in her words, discussed it extensively during the marriage. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I closed the folder. Then I opened it again and read it 4 more times. Discussed it. Because we had conversations at dinner about my plans for the company. Because I mentioned, more than once, that I wanted to add a new service division. Because I talked about maybe building a second facility. That was the foundation of her claim. Dinner table conversations and a few offhand remarks about the future of my business. I called my attorney, Derek, within the hour. Derek had been my business attorney for 3 years at that point. He's the kind of lawyer who doesn't say much, but when he does, every word is doing work. He listened to me summarize the folder without interrupting. When I finished, there was a brief silence. Send me the filing tonight, he said. Already photographed it. Good. And I need your business financial records going back 5 years. Done. When did you formally initiate any steps toward the expansion? That question, that specific question. I felt something shift in my chest when he asked it. Because I knew the answer. And I knew the answer mattered enormously. She filed on March 14th, I said slowly. Right. My first formal meeting with the architect and the financial advisor about the expansion was March 28th. Silence. Then, and before that, I had internal notes. A few preliminary conversations with my operations manager. Nothing signed. Nothing funded. Nothing legally initiated. Another pause. You said you discussed it with her during the marriage. I mentioned it. In the general sense. I want to expand someday. That kind of conversation. Derek's voice stayed even. What about the equity structure of the expansion? This is where it gets important. About 8 months before Nicole filed, I had a separate consultation with a business attorney, not Derek, a specialist in business structuring, about the best way to legally protect a potential expansion from personal liability. At the time, I was thinking about future investors, credit liability, legal exposure. I wasn't thinking about divorce. But the result of that consultation was a recommendation to structure any future expansion as a separate business entity with its own equity framework, distinct from the original company, with clear ownership documentation tied to investment dates. I hadn't formally created it yet, but I had the framework on paper, dated, documented, reviewed. I have an advisory memo from a business structuring attorney from last August, I told Derek. Dated August 9th, 7 months before she filed. I heard him write something down. Send me that too. Already pulling it. Good, he said quietly. And then, almost like he was talking to himself, this is going to be fine. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters for understanding what came next. I didn't become methodical about this because I was planning ahead for a divorce. I became methodical about this because I'd spent a decade building something from nothing, and I had watched other business owners lose pieces of their companies to bad structuring, messy contracts, and assumptions that were never formalized. I protected my work because I respected it, because it was mine in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else. Those 22 employees showed up every morning because I built something that could sustain them. That weight didn't belong to anyone else. And now someone was standing at the edge of it with a legal document that used the word projected, as if projection was the same as possession. The next few weeks were a specific kind of exhausting. Anyone who's been through a divorce will tell you it's not one sustained explosion. It's 100 small ones. A voicemail from an unknown number that turns out to be her attorney's paralegal. A text from a mutual friend who just wants to check in, but is clearly gathering information for one side or the other. A moment at 2 a.m. where you're staring at a spreadsheet and you realize you're not sure if you're looking at financial records or some evidence of the life you built and whether it was ever really shared. I moved into the office's back room for the first 2 weeks. There was a couch back there, bad lighting, and a coffee maker that had never once produced a decent cup. But it was mine in a way that felt uncomplicated. I didn't eat well. I didn't sleep well. But I worked with a kind of focus I hadn't had in years. My operations manager, Qley, figured out something was wrong within 3 days. Qley had been with me since year 2. He's one of those people who says very little but notices everything. He appeared in the doorway of the back room one morning, 2 cups of coffee, said nothing, handed me one, and sat down. You want to tell me what's happening? Divorce. He nodded slowly. Business okay? Not if her attorneys have their way. Another nod. What do you need from me? I looked at him for a second. Documentation of every project-level decision I made independently in the last 18 months. Dates, scope, anything that shows the expansion was my initiative and no one else's. I can have that for you by Thursday. I need it by Wednesday. Tuesday, he said, standing up. That's Qley. The first formal legal meeting happened about 3 weeks after the filing. Both attorneys, both parties, a conference room with bad carpet, and a view of a parking garage. Nicole sat across from me in a gray blazer, her attorney beside her. A woman named Petra who had a reputation in our county for being extremely aggressive in asset division cases. I'd done my homework. She opened with a summary of Nicole's position. The core argument was this. The marital estate included not just current business value, but anticipated value based on an expansion that was, quote, conceived and developed during the marriage using marital resources including time, emotional support, and shared financial planning discussions. Emotional support. They used that phrase in a legal argument. I kept my face neutral. Derek let her finish. Then he did something I've come to deeply appreciate about him. He didn't argue. He just asked a question. Can you specify which marital resources were directly invested in the expansion? Petra consulted her notes. The shared household income allowed the business owner time and stability to develop these plans. And can you point to any specific financial investment, any documented dollar amount from marital funds, directed toward the expansion? A pause. The shared lifestyle created the foundation. A dollar amount, Derek said, still calm. From marital funds. Toward the expansion. Petra shifted. We believe the expansion was. No dollar amount, Derek said, and wrote something down. It was quiet for a moment. Over the next 2 months, the legal process unfolded in the way these things do, slowly, expensively, and with a kind of grinding bureaucratic patience that tests you in ways no argument ever could. I learned that divorce law, at its core, is often an exercise in specificity. Vague claims die on documentation. General assertions crumble against dated records. The expansion that Nicole's attorneys characterized as a product of the marriage had a very specific problem. It didn't legally exist yet when she filed. There was no entity, no signed contracts, no dedicated funding, no formal project scope. There were notes, conversations, an advisory memo, and a vision I'd been carrying around in my head for 3 years. But vision doesn't have equity. Plans don't have a share price. Derek built our response around a simple, devastating timeline. March 14th, Nicole files for divorce. March 28th, first formal architect and financial advisor meeting regarding expansion. April 3rd, first formal operating agreement drafted for expansion entity. April 17th, first capital allocation from post-separation business accounts to expansion planning. May 2nd, legal formation of the separate expansion entity, with full equity documentation dated from that point forward. Every single dollar, every single decision, every single legal milestone of the expansion. Post-separation, not 1 cent of marital funds, not 1 hour of marital time that could be legally attributed. The expansion I was being asked to split had been built, legally, financially, structurally, in the months after Nicole walked out that door. There's a moment in any legal fight where you can feel the other side's confidence start to crack. It's not dramatic. It's not a movie courtroom scene where someone slams down evidence and everyone gasps. It's subtler than that. It's the email response time slowing down. It's the shorter statements. It's the way Petra started prefacing things with "our position remains" instead of "our position is." Qualifiers. Hedges. The language of someone who knows the foundation is soft and is trying not to put too much weight on it. I noticed it about 6 weeks in. Derek noticed it earlier. They're going to try to settle, he told me one afternoon. On what terms? Unknown. But I'd expect them to retreat from the expansion claim and focus on the base business valuation, which is what we already agreed to, right? But they'll present it like a concession. He was right. 3 days later, a settlement proposal arrived. They dropped the expansion claim entirely. They offered to proceed with standard equitable distribution of the existing business value as of the date of filing, which, I'll note, was fair. The existing business, the one I'd built over 10 years, was a marital asset in the relevant sense. Nicole had been present for portions of that journey. She hadn't invested in it directly, but she'd been there. I was prepared to honor that honestly. I wasn't fighting to take everything. I was fighting to keep what was mine after she left. That's a different thing. We went to court anyway. Not because settlement failed. We were close on several points. But Nicole had a specific number in her head that was tied to the expansion projection, and she wasn't fully ready to let it go yet. Her attorney made one last attempt to argue that the conceptual development of the expansion during the marriage created an equitable interest in the eventual profits. The judge, a methodical man named the Honorable Court, as I'll call him for this, had clearly done his homework. He asked Petra directly, "Counsel, is there documentation of any marital funds used toward the expansion entity?" The expansion was conceived. I asked about funds, counsel. The conceptual development occurred. Counsel. His voice was patient but firm. Please answer the question I'm asking. A pause. No documented marital funds were directly invested. And the formal establishment of the expansion entity, when was that dated? Derek provided the documentation. The judge reviewed it without expression. The expansion entity was formed on May 2nd of this year. The separation filing was March 14th. That's correct. Yes, Your Honor, Derek confirmed. And all capital allocation toward this entity originates from post-separation accounts. Fully documented, Your Honor. The judge looked at Nicole's table for a moment. Then he looked at his documents again. Then he set them down. The court finds that the expansion entity does not constitute a marital asset under the applicable statutes. The equity structure, formation date, and funding sources place this entity outside the marital estate. He continued. I looked at my hands for a second. Cole had texted me that morning. Call me when it's done. I was going to have a good call to make. The final settlement took another few weeks to formalize. The base business, my original company, was valued and divided fairly, as it should have been. I kept controlling interest. Nicole received a structured payout reflecting her entitlement under equitable distribution, which was honest and appropriate. I didn't fight that. I'd never fought that. What I'd fought was a claim on something that didn't exist when she left. Something that was built in the months after the door closed. Something that was mine because I was the one who kept building when everything else was falling apart. The expansion entity remained wholly mine. Clean documentation. Clear equity. No ambiguity. Life moved on the way it does. I poured everything into the expansion. The new facility broke ground that fall. The service division launched 8 months after that. Within 18 months of the ruling, the expansion had exceeded every conservative projection I'd modeled. Qley came into my actual office now. I'd moved out of the back room by then, and handed me a quarterly report one afternoon. He didn't say anything. He just put it on my desk. I looked at the numbers. Then I looked up at him. He did something I don't think I'd ever seen him do before. He smiled. Not bad, he said. Not bad. I agreed. 7 months after the ruling, I got a text from a number I recognized immediately, even though I hadn't looked at it in nearly a year. It said, "Hey, can we talk? Not legal. Just talk." Nicole. I stared at it for a long time. I wasn't angry. I want to be clear about that, because I think the easy assumption is that I would be. But the anger, if it had been there, had spent itself somewhere in those long nights in the back room, staring at spreadsheets and listening to the building settle. What I felt reading that message was something closer to a careful, practiced stillness. I didn't respond that day. I thought about it for 2 days. Not about what she wanted. I had a pretty clear idea. But about what I wanted. What was worth my time and what wasn't. What kind of man I wanted to be in this specific moment. On the 3rd day, I replied, "I'll talk. Coffee. Thursday." She was already there when I arrived. Different haircut. She looked tired, but the kind of tired that comes from realizing something rather than from losing something. I sat down. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I didn't think the expansion thing would actually go that way," she said. Not an apology. Not an opening move, exactly. Just a statement. "Which part?" I asked. "The structuring. The dates. All of it." She shook her head slightly. "My attorney made it sound like." She trailed off. I waited. "She made it sound like the fact that you talked about it, that it was part of our shared plans, made it something I was entitled to." "Shared plans," I said. "I know. Nicole, I talked about wanting to expand my company the same way I talked about wanting to go to Portugal someday. It was a dinner table thing. There were no shared plans." She was quiet for a moment. "I know that now." "You knew it then," I said, without heat. "You just thought the law might see it differently." She looked at her coffee. "Yeah. Honesty. I appreciated that. Why did you reach out?" I asked. She was quiet for a second. "Because I think I convinced myself I deserved something that I hadn't actually built," she said slowly. "And I wanted to say that out loud to you. Not to my therapist. Not to my friends. To you. I thought about that. I appreciate you saying it. I'm not asking for anything," she added quickly. "I know." We sat for a moment. The coffee shop was busy around us. All those small dramas of ordinary life moving past. People arguing about oat milk, a kid dropping a croissant, someone laughing too loudly at their phone. "How's the expansion?" she asked. And for some reason, I laughed. "Just a short one." "Good," I said. "It's really good." She nodded, something in her face that I couldn't quite read. Not jealousy, not regret, not happiness exactly. Just acknowledgement. "That's good," she said. "You worked hard for it." I did. We finished our coffees. We talked for a little while about nothing in particular. Old mutual friends, the neighborhood we used to live in, a restaurant that had apparently closed. Normal, slightly awkward, fundamentally human. When we stood to leave, she paused. "I hope it keeps going well for you." I believed her, and that surprised me a little. "You too," I said, and I meant it. I've thought a lot since then about what I would tell someone who found themselves in a version of what I went through. Not about the legal strategy. Derek is very good at his job, and other situations are different. But about the broader thing. About what it means to build something that's genuinely yours. There's a version of this story that gets told as a victory narrative. Guy outsmarts his ex-wife in court. Protects his empire. Walks away with everything. But that's not actually what happened. What happened is that I built something. Then I kept building after someone said it was over. And because I had documented everything, because I had structured things deliberately, because I had respected my own work enough to protect it formally, the law was able to see it clearly. The law didn't do me any favors. The law just read the dates. March 14th, March 28th, May 2nd, numbers and dates and documented decisions. The story was already written in the records. The court just read it out loud. There are things I would do differently. In the marriage, I mean. Not the legal stuff. The marriage. I would have said the things I was noticing instead of waiting for her to say something. I would have called it out when the distance started growing. I would have been less comfortable with comfortable silence and more interested in uncomfortable honesty. Not because it would have saved the marriage. I genuinely don't know if it would have. But because I think we both deserve the chance to either fix it or end it with clarity instead of just drifting toward a folder left on a kitchen counter. That's on both of us. And I can say that without it taking anything away from the fact that I was right about the expansion. Both things are true at the same time. That's how most things actually work, if you're being honest with yourself. The expansion is in its second full year now. We recently signed a contract that made it into something I couldn't have projected in even my most optimistic models. I have a team I trust. I have a business I built twice. Once when I was young and hungry, and once when I was gutted and still moving. I have a coffee mug on my desk. Not the cracked one from the kitchen. A new one. A good one. One that doesn't need to be replaced. Cole came in the morning after we signed the big contract and set a bottle of bourbon on my desk without a word. I looked at it. Little early, I said. Little early, he agreed, and went back to his office. We had it that evening. It was good. I think what this whole thing actually taught me, the thing that lives underneath the legal story and the business story, is that documentation is a form of self-respect. When you document something, you're saying, this is real, this matters, and I am willing to be held accountable for what I've done. You're also saying, I was here. I made this. And here's the proof. Nicole could claim I talked about the expansion during our marriage, and that was true. But talk isn't equity. Conversation isn't capital. Presence isn't investment. And the law, whatever its many flaws, understood that distinction with a clarity that the human heart sometimes struggles to maintain. I heard through a mutual friend, about a year after the coffee meeting, that Nicole had started her own consulting practice. Operation strategy, apparently. She's good at that. She always was. And I found, when I heard that I was genuinely glad. Not in a performed way. Not in the way you say things to seem like a better person than you are. Actually glad. Because whatever happened between us, whatever was lost or misread or left too long in silence, she deserved to build something of her own. Everyone does. That's kind of the whole point. You build what's yours. You protect what you've built. You're honest about the difference. And you keep moving. A few people in my life have asked me, in the 2+ years since this began, whether I think she really believed she was entitled to the expansion or whether she was just seeing what she could get. I've thought about it. And my honest answer is, I think she believed it a little. Not fully. Not cynically. But when you're in pain and you're angry and you're trying to make sense of years that didn't work out the way you'd planned, it's human to look around for something that might make the math feel more even. It doesn't make it right, but it makes it understandable. The problem wasn't that she wanted something. The problem was that what she wanted didn't belong to her. And the documentation made that fact undeniable. I'm not going to tell you I've fully figured out the balance between protecting your work and protecting your relationships. I don't think that balance is something you figure out once. I think it's something you navigate constantly, imperfectly, with varying degrees of success. What I can tell you is that I've stopped apologizing for how seriously I take what I've built. I spent the first few years of my business half embarrassed by how much it meant to me. Like caring that deeply about your own work was somehow excessive or uncomfortable. I don't feel that way anymore. Those 22 employees, it's 31 now, across both entities, they're real people with real lives and real mortgages and real kids who need school supplies and real parents who need help. The work matters because it produces things that matter. And I will document every single piece of it for as long as I'm doing it. Not defensively, not out of fear, but because the story of what you build deserves to be told accurately. In dates and dollars and decisions and entities and documented equity. The whole story, starting March 28th, not a day before. If you're sitting somewhere right now reading this because you're in the middle of something that feels like it might unravel everything, the work, the relationship, the plan you had for how your life was supposed to go, I'm not going to offer you a clean resolution. I don't have one. I have a bourbon story about a business partner who doesn't talk much. I have a coffee meeting with an ex-wife who said the right thing when she didn't have to. I have a cracked mug I finally threw away sometime last winter when I was cleaning out the office and found it in a box I'd never unpacked. I held it for a second, set it down, tossed it, went back to work. That's the whole of it, really. The ruling was clear. The equity was documented. The story, when they read it aloud, matched the one I'd been living. And that, the simple, stubborn, exhausting work of making sure your story matches your records, turned out to be everything.